Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our webinar on adapting your pricing in the age of AI. I'm Nicola, co-chapter head of London Pavilion, and very excited to be discussing this hot topic. It keeps coming up at Pavilion dinners and was definitely top of mind at SaaStock in Dublin earlier this week. And some interesting info from everyone that signed up for the webinar. 14% had already switched to a consumption-based model. 20% were planning to in the next 6 months, and 55% were reviewing it. Now, before I hand over to our three expert pricing panelists, I would love it if you could all introduce yourselves in chat. And I have two questions. Number one, who, if anyone, owns pricing in your business? And number two, are you considering moving to a consumption-based pricing model? Now, we will make sure we have time for Q&A at the end, so please do ask questions as we go, and we'll make sure we cover as many as possible. So, without further ado, let's get some intros from our panelists. Andreas, let's start with you.
Cool. Yeah, nice to meet everyone. So I've been working in and around pricing for, I guess, since 2008. So for a consultancy, so I worked in consulting for quite a while, mostly private equity owned businesses, and then ran a team at a business called Clarivate, which had been spun out of Thomson Reuters. But then most recently, about 3.5 years at Notion Capital. So working with kind of Series A, B businesses on pricing, but really broader than that, and sort of go to market more generally trying to help them move from founder-led sales to something more repeatable and scalable. So yeah, nice to meet you all and looking forward to the session.
And Andreas, how many of your portfolio are looking into this at the moment, moving into this type of model?
I'd still say it's a minority. So we probably have 50 portfolio companies. Maybe 2 or 3 are consumption based, maybe a little bit higher. And maybe another 2 or 3 kind of thinking about it. So not dominating my portfolio.
Thank you. Lily, tell us all about you.
Yes, great to meet you all. So I'm at Cruxy. We're a growth intelligence firm, and we work with B2B tech companies on cracking challenges around pricing, packaging, market and product growth. Personally, I've been at the business for 8 years, and I've led probably about 60 of our pricing and packaging restructures. And I think the last 2 years in particular, we've been very busy with helping people transition to AI pricing, whether it's hybrid or whether it's kind of rolling out a new model. So yeah, it's definitely a tricky one. There's definitely not a right or wrong. There's lots of experiments that can still happen, but I think always great to hear some more stories and different perspectives on it.
Thanks, Lily. And Mark?
Awesome. Hey, everyone. My name's Mark. I'm a go-to-market strategy manager and pricing manager at Lucanet, so lovely dual hat. I've been in the business for just over a year, but I was also previously at a consulting business doing pricing and sales strategy. So led some interesting stuff, figuring out, indeed, like many of you, probably the strategy for AI pricing right now for our solutions, and also tried to figure out pricing in multiple regions that we've expanded to as well. So yeah, really looking forward to this call as well.
I'm looking forward to hearing some of your stories, Mark.
Mm.
Well, Lily and Andreas, we were actually discussing pricing at Paddle's office on the 27th of October last year. So it's nearly a year on. And I feel like so much has changed since then. Lily, I'd love to hear from you. How do you think AI has shifted the fundamentals of SaaS economics in general? And what implications have you seen this had over the last 12 months on pricing models?
So a big one. I think what we've seen in the last year is a lot more, as people have had much more robust AI offerings, AI products, they've actually got customers using them, etc., which is perhaps a bit different than a year ago for the majority of the companies that we work with. We're seeing people a lot more decoupling the costs of the AI with the revenue that they're charging for it, whereas previously we saw them, really just doing a lot more cost plus. And we're seeing models where people are trying to implement it where revenue and cost has to actually move together. It's tricky to execute. There's definitely techniques you can use, whether it's caching or batching or, different techniques you can use in the pricing to do that. But what we're seeing is people really trying to move away from being in that trapped between the kind of hyper scaling infrastructure costs and the revenue that they want to charge back to their clients. And then the other thing is we're seeing, which I'm sure we'll get onto later, obviously much more of a hybrid approach being adopted for companies who weren't AI first and have implemented, and it's a bit easier to make sure that you're reconciling the costs across different platform fees and things like that. But yeah, I would say a year ago, we were seeing a lot more cost plus, whereas I think now we're seeing a lot more models that actually try and decouple the cost from the revenue that they're charging for it.
And what are the pros and cons of decoupling it? Why have people changed to this?
So I think the cons are it's definitely more complex to do and build a model to achieve that. It also needs to be something which isn't super rigid and you can continue to flex it, which again is fairly difficult to execute. But the pros are, I think, massively, you're not stinging customers. You're not stinging customers on volume fees, etc. when the value of the platform that you're able to deliver with AI as a capability might not scale in the same way for the solution that you're bringing to market. So we've definitely seen higher adoption rates and things from people who have been able to achieve that.
And Andreas, you mentioned a couple of the portfolio have moved to this and a few more are considering it. What have you seen in terms of the key triggers that are making companies want to switch?
So I think primarily aligning kind of variable costs to how they charge, where they haven't really had to spend a lot of time kind of thinking about variable costs, because margins in SaaS have always been right 80% plus, and you didn't have to pay too much attention. And then you incorporate some kind of AI feature or module because you have to be doing something in AI, and your cost dynamics are completely different. And so you have to be, realizing they need to spend much more time looking at the cost side. But then, as to what kind of Lily was talking about, that doesn't necessarily match the value. So you could have a lot of activity, but not really be driving much value for the customer. So it's just trying to take both perspectives. So you need to protect margins, but it's got to make sense for the customer. And so I have one portco kind of thinking through this right now, where they have a portfolio of customers, some on not great margins, but not necessarily getting a ton of value. It's just the way in which they use the product just creates that outcome. And then other customers not using it a lot, but getting great value out of it and actually driving great margins. So you've got this kind of mismatch they sort of have to work through. Yeah, I don't think there's kind of a silver bullet to it. It's just sort of understanding how different customers use the product, different use cases, and how those usage profiles drive different sort of margin profiles. And then for them deciding, what's the business they want versus the business that maybe is not worth going after. And then maybe actually looking at things at more of a portfolio level, because maybe you have some customers on like, I don't know, 60% margin, and which is low, and then others at 80%. But on average, if you look at the full portfolio, it's still acceptable. So maybe being a bit more flexible with kind of the range of margins.
That's so interesting. And I think that's a really important point about what value is the customer getting, because we often have no idea how much it's costing the business. And we could just be expecting this is like a fundamental offering of the product, yet it's actually hemorrhaging margins. So yeah, something really important. How are they perceiving it? Mark, obviously you're in-house now.
Yeah.
Has this been something you've been diving into in depth?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first conversation I remember I had multiple months or even a year ago was with the CTO, and he told me about how for one of our early kind of adopter programs or early releases. We had a solution where it cost, I think it was like €5 per call or per report rather. And quickly after that, it just like skyrocketed as we tried to enhance the model to make it more accurate to €50. So his perception, I think, was really phased by the cost side of things, which definitely made sense. But what we tried to do is, for example, last week we had a hackathon. We were working through some of the agents, what's the ROI that we can get for the customer, and now we're trying to think about how we can validate that a bit with the customer as well. So I mean, the thing is, right, the price can go from 5 to 50 or whatever that number is, but eventually it'll come down massively again, especially as the number of calls or actions repeat and the amount of work that's required incrementally decreases. So yeah, I think the two things we've had to do is really chat with our CTO to help him understand the longer term pricing vision, and also second is get our product folks thinking in terms of what is that the value or the ROI that we create for our customers.
Yeah, and I guess also is there work you can do on the product side to reduce some of those costs as well? So, previously, I think even 12 months ago, there was a lot of conversations about seat-based pricing. Is there still a place for that now? And if so, how does that tie into the usage consumption base? Are we all looking at more of a hybrid model now? Mark, have you been looking at that?
Yeah, we actually were looking at that when we acquired a business last year, and so the solution is heavily it's quite similar to an Excel, let's say, where the amount of value a customer gets is by the number of cells that's being used. So we're thinking this is a great opportunity for us to move towards usage-based pricing. But I mean, that is really difficult. Our business has been around since 1999, and a lot of our customers that we want to cross-sell into might be more traditional in the way that we think. So we didn't really want to push usage fully, right? So it's definitely a hybrid approach for us where we've got the base price and still a user price, and then introducing a kind of usage-based price on top of that. The big issue for us was as well, like customers when they're getting a new product might not necessarily understand their usage. So you need to give them at least 6 months to a year to help understand that. And also importantly, which I know I kind of looked over, it was give them access to know their usage, not just on I'll just email and understand it. We need it in the products so they can see, get familiar and be more comfortable with their usage going up and down. Because as you probably know, a lot of these solutions, the usage can differ dramatically from month to month or whatnot.
And I'm guessing that wasn't necessarily on the product roadmap. So it's like, hang on, we actually have to build in some reporting to be able to move to this model.
Yes, indeed.
Really, I think we're going to be coming back to that. Lily, how have you seen that with clients and moving to hybrid or more of a pure play on one side or the other?
Yeah, I think seats are definitely dying, at least as the pure way of monetizing. I think lots of even public market examples like Blackline and Encino and a lot of these players moving away from per seat pricing. We're seeing in a lot of our projects as well, companies with historically really strong, 109 to 120 NRR seat expansion is just continuing to decline. And of course, as we all hope, many of our AI capabilities will start to take over and the efficiency gains, it's just logical to assume that's going to continue. So I think we definitely see that it's dying and that there's a shift away. I think the how is a bit more tricky because customers are familiar. Every time we do a survey or every time we do an interview, people are like, yeah, I get it. It's easy. I can get that signed off. I can predict it. I can calculate it. So there's definitely an ease around seat-based pricing. And as you start to talk about usage, to Mark's point, people are like, well, I can't predict that. What's that going to be in 3 years? How am I going to get budget? Yeah, I'll bake in 10%, of contract increase, but what's that going to look like? So we definitely see people struggle a little bit with pure usage. Generally, I think practically hybrid has been working well for a lot of players in the market, as long as that mix between fixed and consumption is really aligned to value, depending on the offering that they have. So yeah, I think the mindset is you and your customers, people aren't going to be able to control the volatility of usage. So it's just thinking about what structures can you put in place around pricing to kind of sit within those parameters. So simple things like using tiers and bands rather than walkthroughs. So you're not having to have loads of one-off arrears pricing, for example. So how do you create a little bit of control around what is inevitably going to be fairly volatile usage? And I think the final point is obviously with AI products and capabilities as they're new, we've seen a few clients where, you know, they've baked it in or done it as an add-on and they don't actually know how people are going to use it. So you don't even know how that's going to affect your revenue, or the client doesn't know necessarily how that's going to affect their price point. So again, how can you kind of bake some structures simply into the pricing to just put a little bit more of control parameters around it?
Yeah, and really hard for the sales team as well, because not only for internal forecasting, which we're going to come on to, when they've got their champion trying to sell it into the prospects business, like, well, what's this going to be costing us? It's really hard for them to forecast too.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's come up quite a bit in discussions is, how do you actually determine what the unit of value should be? Andreas, you know, when you're talking about an AI offering, is it tokens, resolutions, outcomes? Are they all kind of the same thing, just with a different word? I find I can get quite confused in their space.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, the way I'd approach it is thinking through, just coming up with a long list. I think like getting the right people in a room. So sales, product, engineering, customer success, and just kind of being creative about it and thinking through all the ways one could charge. And there are some kind of cost considerations that will make it into there. For example, we get, you know, we get charged per API call. So, you know, who are we using as a supplier and what do our cost dynamics look like? And so what are those metrics? And then thinking through how the customer uses the product. So what are some usage metrics, you know, relevant to that, to your proposition? You could think of it, I guess, from like an input perspective or like an activity perspective, like things people do on your system, or maybe from like an outcome perspective. So I think there's different lenses to look at it through, and then just sort of coming up with a long list and being quite creative about it and just making sure you're comprehensive about all the ways one could charge. Like what are the different sort of metrics you could attach price to, and then sort of narrowing it down, right, to say, okay, well, what can we actually track? What does the client understand? What do they see as fair? What can we execute from like a quote to cash process? And then you start to narrow that down. So usually that very sort of creative initial exercise leads back to something much less creative and simpler. And it's like, okay, it's going to be per user and it's going to have some kind of cost-based usage element. But I think it's still important to go through the process and just make sure you haven't missed anything.
Yeah.
So that's how I'd think of it anyway. Just sort of run that sort of process.
And make sure you get buy-in across the business as well.
Yeah.
Lily, what are you seeing as the most common units of value? And any that you say, it's going to be really tricky, I would stay away from these.
I think Andreas makes a great point. It's blending like, what are all the good ideas we've got, and then what can we actually execute on as kind of step. I think
very different.
That's often where people kind of forget one or the other. I think in terms of what we see, we've definitely seen a huge spread. Common things are just price per run, price per agent run, things like that. Other common things being tokens, credits. I think generally, maybe this is somewhat controversial, but generally when we speak to buyers, credits and tokens are not the preference. I think it's a psychological thing. I'd be interested to see what other people see. But if you're given a certain amount of tokens and you don't use them, versus if you're in an up to 5,000 band and you don't use them, it feels more wasteful, I think, to people on tokens and credits. I think
Lily, can I just ask, can you just define what you mean by a token and a credit?
I'll give it a go, but there's definitely so many different variations. The way that we typically see a credit or a token is you get one unit and you can use that unit on a number of defined things. We've worked with products where a token, 5 tokens could be one run of this kind of agent, or 1 token could be one resolution of this type of activity. So it's basically a unit of value, and you get given a bucket to utilize on a number of different things. That's how we've typically, I don't know, Mark, Andreas, if you've seen it used in any different ways as well.
It just makes me think of Fairgrounds, because there was like three tokens for this, which is maybe similar. Actually, I'm just gonna, Simon, if you're okay to come off mute, I know you're using tokens, and I'd love to know how you're using them.
So our clients, we're a bit pre $1 million right now, so we're quite young. The company's only been out a year, and Talent Pilot is essentially doing AI recruiting. So Alex, our recruiter, does an interview, and the results of that interview then get added to the candidate score. So every time the interview takes place, we're burning through tokens to actually do that interview. And we're pricing per minute of the interview. So it's 40 cents per 40 cents per minute. So a 5-minute pre-screen will cost you $2 kind of thing. So that number is in the client's head, or if it's longer, then it can be $10, $15. And what you're comparing it to is obviously a person who would do a pre-screen, or a recruiter who would do an interview. Now, my CEO likes to say, obviously, that we're not negative like some of the bigger players like Lovable, etc. We're actually, there is margin in what we're doing, so it's not as high as the margins we're familiar with from SaaS, but we are going to, and this is where I'm lacking detail, we are going to use a cheaper LLM to actually increase that gross margin. And as far as I'm aware, the costs of using 11 labs who are in our stack, it's not really triggered yet, because we have some form of startup allowance. So I hope that gives you detail. In terms of setting the scene, the pricing is governed a little bit by how much would it cost to do an interview.
And Simon, do people prepay? Do your clients prepay for credits, and they have a certain amount?
They do, yes. And I have to, yet again, entire honesty about this, it's a bit of a negotiating thing here, because companies are concerned about, overbuying credits, and what we do is we put in a certain amount for free in a month, and you are paying a subscription cost for a license for a recruiter still. But I can see that there will be significant pressure on that in 2026 and 2027. Yeah, like people will want,
and then
yes, they will. That rate is about 190. Well, it's exactly 199 euros per month per recruiter, and it's a much cheaper price for someone who's not using it for talent acquisition. If they're using it for talent management, or sharing team insights. But I'm mostly excited to be here because of the AI recruiter part, because we're trying to figure out what that pricing is, and what people will connect it to when they go. We're using Talent Pilot, and it is. And I was actually, this is one topic that I would love input on myself, because I was talking to a customer today who had piloted the platform, and I was saying that future budgeting will probably end up looking like, you people budget, obviously, you've got your platforms, and then agents might be a third budget, because agents are a little bit different in what they do when they're doing work, they're learning, etc. And I'm not sure how that will actually look in practice, and how it is actually looking in practice. And I'd love insight.
Yeah. So that's a great question. But it was interesting what Lily said about that customers generally don't like tokens or credits. But Lily, is that pricing that Simon was talking about, is that something you're seeing come up quite a lot, that way of charging?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's still a way that you can be tied to the unit of a credit or a token, but even just position it. It's a bit, product marketing, but you can position it in different ways. You can bake in a certain amount with a base fee. You can make sure there's all the mechanisms in place, a little bit of overage and things like that, just to relieve the pressure, because it's obviously, especially at your scale, you don't want to add so much complexity into the way that you're operating. You need to still keep it simple as you experiment and scale. So there's definitely like little tricks around the edges that you can use to just relieve that pressure a little bit as well.
So you almost have like your base level, and that includes a certain number of credits. I'm thinking ClassPass. This is what's in my head now. And then you can add more. And it'll be interesting as things progress, like, are there certain terminology or names that trigger people in a negative way and in a positive way? So is a token a negative and a credit's positive, or whatever it might be. One thing that I think is challenging for both clients and you as the business owner is how you forecast and then manage this revenue volatility. You know, when you've got seat-based pricing, it's much easier to forecast. Mark, you've obviously made this move. How are you doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so the example I provided before we acquired this business, we applied it. It wasn't necessarily for AI, but it was for these cells, right? So we have our base fee, we still have an included number of cells, and then customers will need to pay for an additional X 100,000 cells, for example, at the start of their contract, and that can be adjusted. At this stage, we don't have like automated upselling, so a customer can't go as freely into that, and that actually protects us a bit because we obviously don't want like a heavy level of downsell. But when that automated upsell downsell functionality does come into play, we're planning to limit it to either X times per year, maybe it's like 4 times per year that you can make that adjustment. But obviously that depends on the type of solution that you're providing. For us, I mean, Winnie, I know you mentioned capping the fee, right? With a fair usage policy, right? We normally have a certain level of flexibility. So if a customer goes, say, 10% above one tier into the next one, and maybe it's not 10%, maybe it's a little bit lower, then we're definitely flexible to allow them to still pay the same amount of fees. In another case where we can't necessarily, maybe they're using a certain number of calls, but maybe we don't necessarily have a credit model, so we can't measure all the time that fair usage policy. At least for us, maybe it's a bit more old school, but we include that fair usage policy within the contract so that we know how many gigs or how many calls or something like that. It's normally done with legal so that we have an absolute cap, but we try and keep that as much outside of the contractual discussion unless there's concerns from the customer. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we've had some horror stories about, I think it was Cursor that I was saying. I think we talk about it later, but yeah, they burnt through their annual allowance in a day when they changed the model. So yeah, I think caps are very interesting.
Yeah.
Lily, when you're working with some of your clients, how are you helping them with the forecasting? And I'm guessing you're modeling out different options depending on the model that they go with.
Yeah, it's definitely not our area of expertise, I would say, but we do try and make sure that in the models themselves, it bakes in, you've got a balanced predictability for the client and predictability for our customer or the tech company. So again, I think Mark covered on a lot of the tactics around fair usage policies, making sure there's minimums in place, making sure that things are typically banded or tiered, or there's some level of you are likely to achieve X. This is obviously a lot easier to do if you have a historic backbook of customers with AI usage that you can kind of model it on. And when we haven't had that, you've had to just build a lot of scenario assumptions and things like that. I think one of the most important things when it's a new product is you really set up a very rigorous tracking process, looking weekly, doing pilots to really try and understand what that usage is likely to be, because it's just impossible to know when you're kind of launching something completely new. So that process and the diligence that you put around that is almost as important as building the perfect model. It becomes null and void if people are using it a completely different way versus expected.
Yeah. And Andreas, when you're looking at where you should be investing, how are you trying to ascertain whether the forecasts that you're seeing are actually likely to be accurate, well, as accurate as they can be, given this the whole usage-based move?
Yeah, it's definitely something our investment team is thinking about more and more. And I think they need to get better at kind of understanding what they should be looking for. But these changes are still fairly new, right? And because we're Series A investors, it's still very young businesses. So they typically have less than 1 million in revenue. And the pricing model they've used is probably not the pricing model they're going to use in future and are typically a bit simpler. Like maybe it's sort of a almost all you can eat or fixed rate or per user. And then it's more kind of after they've scaled beyond 1 or 2 million, they're kind of revisiting pricing and seeing how they should evolve their model. So I guess it's just like the investment team know they need to learn more about this, and they're going to see more businesses with more dynamic kind of revenue models, and they need to take the time to kind of understand it, both from like a not valuation perspective, but I guess forecasting. So, where do they think the business is going to end up in the next year or two, and just really making sure they're not drawing the wrong conclusions from the data they're given access to in the data room, for example. So from that perspective. And then I think just generally investors becoming a bit more sophisticated and flexible over the different models they're seeing. Because like I've sat in a lot of IC meetings, right? And investors can be quite sort of narrow-minded and rigid when it comes to the model. It's like, we want it to be predictable monthly or annual fees, and then reoccurring revenue, and like we know what we're getting into, and it's very stable and predictable. But the world is moving to something a bit more dynamic, and so they're kind of being pulled along, sort of kicking and screaming a little bit, because they would have preferred something really predictable, and the reality is that consumption-based and kind of more outcome-based models are less predictable. So they're having to kind of change their mindset a bit more as well, and sort of upskill themselves and be a bit more open-minded to these different models. But like, make it easy for them, right? Because they don't want to work too hard to understand your, like, if the model is incredibly complex, that's going to, just like it adds friction to a sales process, it adds friction to an investment process.
I think that's a really important tip. And, also if it's complicated for investors, it's going to be complicated for your customers. And I'm wondering, do you think that actually there's going to be a sort of flip back where we don't have seats, but we have, as Simon mentioned, agents? So there'll be more of a predictable revenue basis on the number of agents you're using.
Yeah, I guess it could be kind of per agent or per workflow. I don't know. I'm like less bullish than maybe Lily or Mark are on the changes we're seeing. I mean, look, where's revenue coming from in terms of which model for big AI spend? OpenAI is the gorilla in the room, right? It's 12 billion in revenue. 70% comes from their ChatGPT consumer proposition, which is per user, right? So that's like 9 billion from a per user model. Cursor as well, per user. They've just added kind of a tier for their power users. If you look at like legal tech, where you've got like a fee earner or in-house legal using kind of a sort of co-pilot, it's per user. We've got one called LegalFly, per user, works well. Because I think a lot of these, I don't know how quickly we're going to arrive at the point where AI and these new propositions are displacing labor versus just augmenting it. So it's like, I'm the person, we're not replacing me or my team, but you're augmenting me with this product that's making me much more productive. And so if we're more going that way, then I think per user works just fine, right? Because you're not replacing anyone, you're just sort of making them more productive. And then you just need to protect against these cost spikes where you've got these absolute power users that just annihilate your margin. So you've got to protect against that.
Yeah.
It's more like, how quickly are we going to move into a world of like displacing labor and entire teams? Then I think the models are going to be more radically different, because obviously per user wouldn't make sense at all. I guess Finn is one example. What's the business? Oh crap. Irish business, like customer support, customer service. Intercom, yeah, their new proposition. Finn, so I think, their old propositions were kind of per user, right? And then now they've got Finn, which is like AI native product, and they've done really well. And they talk about it as outcome-based pricing because it's like per resolution.
Yeah,
So
they
it's
say
like
resolution. Yeah.
really, actually, if you look at the small print, it's not. It's just usage based. It's just like they count. It's just they count some conversations and they don't count others. But they're probably one of the more kind of well-known successful transitions. But even there, it wasn't like full outcome-based pricing. It's kind of usage-based.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think it's interesting as well, like how you benchmark it. I think Simon said something else interesting, which is, yeah, you may be buying credits and it looks like, oh my goodness, we're having a 2-minute call and it's going to cost us this much with our AI agent. But what would it cost with a human? Just like with legal tech, they're doing some of the work that you would be using a consultant for. It may look like it's extremely expensive versus what you initially forecast, but it's still probably a lot cheaper than using a legal firm. And, you know, on that note, where so much is around positioning, Lily, when you're working with your clients, if you've agreed, right, we're going to change our pricing, what is the best way to implement this? You know, we've heard some horror stories, Cursor I've already mentioned. You've got a decent customer base, so it's not just about changing your pricing for new customers, but it's also for reducing churn. And then you're hearing stories about, oh, you know, change your pricing and suddenly your sales cycle massively extends as well. What are some of the steps to be thinking about before you roll out?
So firstly, before getting into like the practical execution elements, I think the first thing, the difference that we see between when it's done well and when the results are amazing and when it's not, is when it's done with the packaging. So it has to be done, I think, even to Andreas's point, you know, if the value of the AI is enhancing your current, you know, user-based approach, then it needs to be packaged as such. If it's adding a completely different value proposition, if, you know, we spend so much time arguing with clients who have obviously spent huge numbers in R&D on developing something, and it's like, well, it's kind of just table stakes, and when you speak to the market, they actually don't really value it that much. It will probably make them 10% more efficient, you know. So you actually really have to think of the packaging. And I think when that's done really well and the right elements of AI are either baked in, they're done baked in with a cap, or they're done as additional different solutions or add-ons, etc., it makes all of the difference. We have a couple of clients who actually, we spent so much time on the packaging and their sales cycles have come down. They're both net new and backbook, which is always, backbook's always much harder, but they've had clients who were stagnant for 8 years now upselling and things like that. So it's really in the packaging and the way that the new AI capabilities are centered to that. And then obviously what that has to change as you get into execution is, how are the sales team talking about it? How are they anchoring the value of it in the context of, you know, you're not just going to rip up the world that your customers are living in. You've got to make sure you're still anchoring to the product they're buying today and with you, and making sure you're helping them on that journey. So the packaging, the value proposition, and how that translates from your product to the market is definitely the most important thing. And that really is the biggest difference we see. And then I guess on a more practical basis, there's things like always do a pilot, always make sure that you're starting with the easiest customers first, whether that be your net new rather than tackling your big complex migrations for your install base. So making sure that you have a rigorous pilot plan, you're tracking the results weekly, you're seeing what needs to tweak and what needs to change, because there's no such thing as a perfect pricing model. If it, you know, if sales can't sell it, then, you know, the Excel is whatever. So things like that obviously really help. Putting in tactics around transition and grace periods for customers and things like that. But yeah, from our perspective, I think the packaging is the most important thing.
And Lily, outside of that, are there any other particular areas that businesses forget about and then they come back and bite them later?
I think the one thing we hear every single time is, I wish we started enablement earlier. So when we've worked with, and I'm sure Mark, you're laughing at this, Andreas, I'm sure you've seen this in the portfolio, but it's like, if you are not bringing the company on the journey as you're making the change, and you wait till you've got the perfect outcome and sales don't really understand, like, that's the difference between it succeeding. So I think, you know, being ambitious on a 1-month enablement with a few tests and learning sessions is definitely not going to work. I think that is the number one thing that we hear from people.
That's so important. Take the business on the journey, because it impacts everyone from, you know, product, customer service, and obviously through to sales and marketing. How long do you think you really need from like saying we want to revisit our pricing to actually rolling it out?
I can say from the best that we've seen, so this is high performance, this is one of the best sales orgs that I've worked with. They had, I think we finished the work in March, and they had currently they've got 98% of renewals on their 98% of deals on the new pricing, and they had really amazing results within 3 months. That is, I would say that's quick.
You need 3 months if you're super on top of it and very aligned.
Mark, how long has it taken?
Yeah, Mark,
Yeah.
let's get your.
I was trying to think. I was like, I could say 3 months, but that's not true for us. It was at
Yeah,
least, it was definitely 6 months. I was saying in the chat, one of the things that helped us was like to have a calculator that helped salespeople. I mean, it was a bit technical, so to be honest, I don't think it's the absolute solution, but at least we've got 5 tiers. The salesperson just wants to know which tier to put the customer into. And we want to give them, say, like 5 questions to answer to be able to do that. And that really helped quite a lot. So that's number one. Number two was just like getting product and sales to chat a bit more as well to understand the product, how it works. And I think sales doesn't have to get their whole head around it, but just by understanding, okay, this is how the product works. This is why we're charging for it. Because at least for us, there was quite a few people in the business that had been here for a long time, so they're obviously very used to historical pricing models, and so it took multiple sessions with them to validate the pricing. Then even when we rolled it out, so maybe it was a bit too early to get them back in and say, look, this is how you can calculate it, high level, more detailed. Let's go through with a few customers or with solution engineering to try and do that. So yeah, for sure, at least 6 months, I would say.
And Mark, if you could go back and do it all again, what's one thing you would do differently?
Oh, good question. I mean, for me was everyone likes to tell me as a pricing manager, keep pricing simple. So, I mean, even if we did have 5 tiers, people are saying that's a bit too much. I mean, so that means we had a tier where it would cap and you'd not be able to use more than that. There's a tricky part to it, which is that some customers did want to use more of the use, and we just didn't allow that. But I'd say simply is just to try and create a model that's as simple as possible to explain to sales. At least for us, was because that was our first rollout, as opposed to now multiple AI related solutions are coming out. Just to try and keep it as simple as possible to get the sales team on board and kind of motivated for the rest of the solutions that are now getting rolled out. So adds more complexity.
To be honest, Mark, if your sales team can't understand it, I don't know how on earth your customers are going to be able to understand it.
Yeah.
I want to make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions, so just a few more. When you're rolling out your new pricing and also thinking about whether you should change it, what are those pricing related metrics that are most critical to monitor regularly? Andreas?
I might ping this to Mark or Lily,
Okay.
just because they're in more
Okay.
operational roles. I mean,
Sure.
I'd say like discounts and usage and that kind of thing, but I think Mark's gonna nail this better than I will.
And margin, I'm guessing, because if you've eroded your margin,
Yeah.
then you've got a problem with how you're charging. Mark, coming back to you.
Yeah, I'll say briefly, one is discounts. I mean, I guess
Yeah.
as a pricing person, heavily focused on that. We saw spikes in the first 2 months, so that was pretty obvious. Number two, around usage, at least for me, because we don't have it fully available to all customers, is talking to engineering once every couple of weeks to understand or what that looks like. But then, like the usual ones, right? We said in the chat, the sales cycle, I mentioned that it increased as well. It's like quite a few of those metrics that you typically look at. The challenge for us, at least, and maybe I'm too operational, is like, what is the reason for it? Yes, it could be because we started to roll out the AI functionality, but frequently we have the challenge of there were 2 or 3 other factors at the same time. Which of those factors was to quote unquote blame? Lily,
Right.
what about?
Yeah. So isolating those factors. Lily,
Yeah.
anything you'd want to add?
Yeah, I think you've nailed all the ones that we would definitely track. I think one thing that we always try and encourage is helping people to prioritize what are the metrics that matter for what they are trying to achieve. So we usually do this before we would build or, you know, develop the pricing, because ultimately you can make a model do anything, but if it's about pure ARR growth, if it's about net new, if it's about customer expansion, you're going to be looking at very different metrics. And from our experience, you would always have a trade-off in place. So, for example, if you're really aggressively trying to hit NRR, have your current, you know, we typically work with businesses PE 100 to 500 mil. So often a lot of the focus is on getting more from your current customers. So sometimes the way that you price might have a bit of a trade-off on churn, or it might have a trade-off on net new conversion rate and time to close, etc. So I think we always try and set up, we call them the hard nose, but the kind of 3 metrics at the beginning that you're like, these are the ones we're optimizing for. And then of course we're going to try and make sure everything's good too, but these are the ones that really matter to what we want to achieve in the next 3 to 5 years. Because otherwise we'll try and make everything green, and you know, typically you can't necessarily always achieve that.
Yeah, exactly. And you may have some churn, but actually it may be good churn because they may not be the right customers to work with. Okay, we've got a couple of questions. So I'm going to do one final question, which has got 2 parts. So first part is crystal ball. How do you see pricing changing over the next 12 to 24 months? And question 2 for you is, what's the one piece of advice you would like to give people who are thinking about moving to usage-based pricing? So Andreas, crystal ball, your one piece of advice.
More hybrid models. I think hybrid is the way. It's a bit of a fudge because you kind of you protect the cost side and you capture more value. So I think we'll just see more hybrid. And then one piece of advice: have like a shit hot RevOps leader in the business that's intimately involved with pricing and is looking at how you actually operationalize all of these great ideas. Yeah.
I won't go down the RevOps versus GTM engineer here. I'm going to keep that for a separate conversation. Lily?
Hard to beat those. I love the one on RevOps, and I think definitely agree with the hybrid point. I do think that we're probably going to see a bit more transparency in pricing, even in complex B2B, just from how AI and AI models are changing the pricing. Whereas at the moment, obviously, black box is the norm. I think we're probably going to see a bit more transparency as well.
Mark?
I mean, AI, to Lily, your point, it's going to be table stakes. I don't know if it's 24 months, and obviously it depends on what AI functionality we're developing, but I think frequently it might go increasingly into it could be a good, better, best model as opposed to an add-on. So, I mean, I guess just like really think about the value of the solution that you're developing and think, does it really need to be separate? Because I think that's going to increasingly not be separate, but that's just my hot take. And yeah, I got to say, make sure you can actually implement it, whether it's with DevOps or Salesforce or other teams, like at least for us, because we're a large business. Oh, sorry, we've been around for a long time. There's many teams. It's just it's a case of actually how much adjustments are required in Salesforce and how much more additional reporting or build in the product do we need to actually get this done. And every single time it just goes back to what can we do as simply as possible.
So it ties in nicely with Andreas's point about RevOps and also making sure that your customers can see how much they're using as well. Really great question from Helen here. Like, how long do you need to leave specific pricing and packaging in place to really get a view on what works and what doesn't work, particularly when you've got enterprise deals with longer sales cycles?
I think with consumery stuff, it's very quick. Could be like a month, right? Because you'll see, I think you'll see the impact almost immediately if you've made a mistake or if you've made the right call. Obviously, enterprise sales cycles, you know, if it's 6 months to 18 months, that's tough. So I guess you've got to rely more on the qualitative feedback during the sales cycle in terms of, I don't understand your model. Like, that's a big hint. And yeah, but you're probably still looking at waiting at least 3 to 6 months, maybe a bit longer, right? Is my guess.
Yeah.
You'd have it that fast, would you? Because actually what and I've got a specific scenario in mind that I both had in my last company and actually something where for lots of very sensible reasons an unlimited plan has been introduced where you're selling at an enterprise level rather than doing user based or some sort of other value metric. But inevitably that has a spin-off on NRR, to your point, Lily, when it comes to renewal time, because the expansion potential is lower. So actually, that as a minimum, you've got 12 months before anything will show up in the data there. So it's a real sort of front of mind thing for me, actually, how quickly, because you need data rather than being able to rely too heavily on anecdotes, but you don't want to knee jerk. But if you know that something that you've introduced isn't right, yeah, so there probably isn't one perfect answer, but it's 3 to 6 months feels very quick.
Yeah, I think that's more if
obvious.
it's like a new model and you've just got something wrong and customers are telling you in that sales cycle, like something's wrong. I don't understand this. Can you explain it? And you can see it sort of adding a lot of friction. You probably want to make a change sooner rather than later. But yeah, take your point on it's not something that would show up as fundamentally broken, I think, in your case, and then you need to kind of see it play out, maybe potentially for a year. I don't know if you can kind of scenario model in advance and say, okay, these are the different potential outcomes, and then kind of, I don't know, thinking about if there's any lead indicator that would point to one sort of outcome being more likely than the other. But I mean, it's hard when you've got big lags in the business, right? It's one of the challenges with enterprise.
Yeah, and I can see the whole sort of moving to charging sort of tokens up front conversation earlier, that where it really is a bit shooting in the dark what the price point or what the quantity is going to be. But perhaps the course correction may need to be faster. But then, so I think it's just a really interesting thing that we're all going through.
And just talking about how you sell this in as well, Winnie just asked, in an actual deal, how do you recommend sales to manage contract negotiation when you've got these tiered packages with usage-based billing and caps? Any recommendations on how they should actually be thinking about this and the enablement piece? What do we need to be providing them with to allow them to do that? Winnie, I hope I've explained your question well. Dive in if I haven't.
No, it's great. Thank you.
Yeah, on my side, I mean, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but I mean, in terms of contract negotiation, there's definitely a lot of flexibility. I know there was another comment around don't lose value or the heavy amount of discounting, but within the first year, that level of flexibility is pretty high. I was going to say, like like we said, it's hybrid, right? And at least for us, I don't know if it's high or low, but probably about 15 to 20% is related to that kind of usage-based pricing. So it's still heavily focused on a base and a user fee. And so therefore those negotiations don't have a significant impact. But again, that's because it's our first product. So therefore we're being a lot more conservative. Apart from that, I mean, the calculator, the kind of we also did some scenarios with sales enablement, your typical kind of walkthroughs, but in this case, specifically talking about the pricing component. And then in terms of terms, again, there's a maximum amount that you can have. That's kind of not buried in the contract, but it's not spoken about super clearly upfront. But at least that's because we believe through our tiers it's reasonably protected. And then, we would review. I mean, I know our CS team would review every quarter, so that's typically how we'd get our feedback. But even with sales, we'd normally have a check-in with them every month, so at least we know for this particular product, we know it's going to be a hot topic that we'll just keep on pestering people about and asking them what are you frustrated or challenged by this time round, which they frequently have many things to say about.
I'm going to quickly dive into the last question with 3 minutes to go. From Lauren, any thoughts on retaining value in highly competitive markets where heavy discounts and usage pricing are being used for aggressive land grab? Lily, thoughts on that one?
Yeah, tricky one. And I think it comes down to product value and how you package the offering. I think it kind of bleeds into that sales enablement conversation, because I think what we always try and the principle to always try and uphold is you are setting your pricing and packaging for the what's going to fit 80% of the customers, not the 20% of outliers. Make sure that you've got a really robust deal desk set up for that 20%, where the discounting is really going to come and hammer you, and you need to make sure that you actually have a thoughtful way of approaching that. But again, I think it comes back to, do you truly feel that the product that you have is differentiated versus the competition? On what basis? Why? Is that something you can really defend in the market? There is the reality that sometimes there is a tier, there is a product that is somewhat commoditized, and it has a different role for you. And I think it's just being realistic about what is the role that product needs to play for you, and how can you make sure that that is also defensible in the market environment, whether it's competitive price pressure or price sensitivity from the customer itself.
Yeah. Andreas, anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, packaging, probably the way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you can create kind of a lower cost fighting product. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and massive thank you to Mark, Lily, and Andreas. If people have further questions, are you happy for them to reach out on LinkedIn?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful. I will share the recording. I was thinking you might want to share this with some of your colleagues in a leadership team as you're discussing this. Always a good talking point. And I feel sometimes people pay more attention to a webinar than to what I'm saying. I just need someone else to say it. So we'll share this, and I'll share all the LinkedIn profiles as well. And no doubt we will be running another one. I don't think we'll be waiting a year. I think there might be another session in 6 months. So I apologize in advance, but I will no doubt be banging on your door saying, please come and join me again. Thank you so much. Massively appreciate it. Have a wonderful weekend.